And these are objective measurements. And that's the key. It's a measurement. It's not an opinion. It's a measurement, an empirical measurement. And then I realized, well, there's ways to actually measure diet and what we should be eating. I thought, oh, that's brilliant because then you don't need to rely on an opinion.
Dr. Abbs, how did you find carnivore?
It's a long story. It's a very long story. So I went to university. Initially, I did dentistry, and that's where everything started. And when I was in university, one of the early seeds that was planted was I saw a patient one day whose mouth was covered in plaque. A young guy, just didn't really brush his teeth very well. And I said to the tutor at the time, there's plaque everywhere and it's chronic. Why has he got no tooth decay? Why has he got no gum disease? And obviously, I was a student back then. I had no idea, and the tutor had no idea, and they just didn't give me an answer, and they kind of just told me to shut up and get on with it. Now, the seed had been planted, but I completely forgot about it for a while. Eventually, I graduated. I went out into clinical practice, and sometimes I would see the same thing again, but I never really thought about it too much. And in dentistry, we have gum disease, which, for the technical term, if people want to know, is periodontitis, named after the periodontal ligament and the supporting structures of the teeth, which would start to disintegrate in gum disease. Now, typically, what is taught is patient presents to you with this, you follow this protocol. You treat like this. If they're non-responsive, you refer to a specialist. They may try the same thing. They may take it up a notch and do some kind of surgical intervention. And once that's done, everything's okay. They come back to you. If they do that and it still fails, there's really not a lot you can do apart from keep trying. So they just become one of these eternal patients, just go round and round and round and round. And we've all seen them as dentists. And I had two patients who were in that merry-go-round. I referred them, they had everything done, they came back, still the problem. And they said, "Look, I've had enough. I don't want to keep going." And I said, "Look, that's fine. I do get it. I don't blame you." And then different patients, different time periods. But 6 months later, roughly, they came back for a checkup. And for some reason, everything had cleared. There was no gum disease. All the gums on her teeth were rock solid and tight. There was no looseness, absolutely nothing. There was no issue anywhere, no tooth decay, no new gum disease. And that was completely against what the protocol said. If you stop treatment and you've got active problems, things are going to get worse. It's just a given. It just doesn't happen that things spontaneously disappear to that extent by themselves after treatment had failed. And I thought, what the hell's gone on? And back then, one of the two, one of them said, "I went keto." I didn't know what that was. And another one said, "I went carnivore." I didn't know what that was. I thought that was having a bit more steak with your chips or something like that. So I thought, what the hell is that? And then I didn't really pay too much attention because I thought they're just flukes. They've done something or they've lied or something. I always refused to believe it. I'm embarrassed to say. But then I started reading into things a little bit. I started reading into a guy called Weston Price, who I'm very lucky to have found, which I'm sure many people in around this community and health sphere will have heard of. And for those that don't know, he was a dentist, and for me, he's one of the royalty of nutrition research. Even though he's not a nutritionist, he's a dentist. But we see things as dentists that it's too long to describe, but we see things before they happen because of the way things are related. And Weston Price, with his wife, he went around the world looking at indigenous tribes because he saw that kids on high fat diets just weren't getting the problems that ones on high carb diets were. And so that's when he went around the world looking at indigenous tribes, and he found that all these tribes, with no Medicare, with no NHS, with no whatever medical treatment, no Uber Eats, nothing, they all had perfect skin. They had symmetrical faces, and they had perfectly straight teeth. They had no decay. They had no gum disease, and he couldn't work out how that's possible. And looking at that, I was fascinated. So then, I understand now why that is. It's all to do with the diet. Hence why dentistry is so diet related completely, and everything is related to diet. So we end up on that track. So once I understood that, I then looked more into nutrition a lot. And looking into nutrition, anyone that does that is going to understand obesity more. So I developed this interest in obesity, and that then essentially turned into an interest in metabolism, because obesity is what happens on a macro scale, organismal scale, when biochemically the metabolism is being played with, shall we say. But then when I started looking into metabolism and I got deeper and deeper and more detailed, you can't help but end up looking at mitochondria and the way that the energy cycles work, like the Krebs cycle and glycolysis and all these sorts of things. So then I started looking into that, and that's where I am today. I look into that now. I'm also a consultant in biotech research. I specialize in mitochondrial function and proteomics. So when you look at mitochondria, you end up really understanding aging, diet slash nutrition, and chronic disease such as metabolic syndromes, cancers, all these sorts of things. You understand all three of those at the same time without trying to work on any one individually. And so that's what I do pretty much full time now. I treat patients. I'm based most of the time here in London, in the UK. I treat patients for both cosmetic and longevity medicine. And I also teach. I've taught around the world in different universities, doctors, conferences. As we've spoken off air, I've just come back from New Zealand where I taught biochemistry there. I'm off to Norway after this, and I'm doing the same thing there. And I also consult for companies in technological development. So I also work in semiconductor space. We develop medical technology and things like that, and LED technology. And then I work with professional athletes, say in the Premier League, Bundesliga, Serie A, all these things for performance optimization as well. And that is basically a extension of cosmetic and longevity medicine, because the way we optimize performance, by making the body basically work as best as possible, is the same as what we do in longevity. By working the body as best as possible, we also eradicate things like diseases and all those sorts of things. So that's how I ended up in carnivore and what I do now for a living, because it all kind of goes hand in hand, essentially. It's a bit of a long-winded answer, but hopefully it gives people a thorough picture of why I went from dentistry and how to what I do now.
Yeah. So, that just seems like you've got an insane schedule. Um, but what is the optimum diet then? Is carnivore the optimum diet for everybody?
It's a good question. I think instead of giving a yes or no, I'll give people context to the yes or no, and then give it, because I think that's much more actionable information. This is a question which I asked myself, because when I first started looking into Weston Price, I thought, well, if we've got all this medical care and ability to prescribe drugs and stuff, but we're coming out of the womb with terrible teeth and asymmetrical faces, diet has to be it if these indigenous tribes aren't having the issue. And in fact, I always use this example for anyone interested. In the UK, many years ago, there was a car park in Leicester, a city called Leicester. And underneath that car park, they ended up finding the lost body of King Richard III. It's really a random coincidence, but it laid there for many, many centuries, and they dug it up. And if you look at that picture, surprise, surprise, you had straight teeth. There's no coincidence. And after looking at things like that, yeah, same question came up. What is the optimal diet? And the issue with this question is it's very opinion heavy. It's very subjective. It's very, or it can be, I should say. It can be subject to consensus and all these sorts of things. And I thought, well, there's no point having an answer that's subjective, because it could be right, it could be wrong. People are biased, people have paychecks, all these sorts of things. So surely there must be a better way than to have subjectivity. And there is. And I'll describe to people why you can trust it, and then I'll give the answer. If I was to do a urine test on someone, a urinalysis, I could say with 100% confidence what you may, or let's say you've not been drinking enough water or you've been drinking too much. It's pretty simple to say yes or no to that. And you can't argue because it's right there. You can see it. And if we did the same with a hair test, hence why they use it in court systems and judicial systems, they can take a sample of hair and say, was there cocaine taken in the past 6 months, whatever, depending on the length of the hair. And again, the person can't argue because it's there. It's right in the hair. You can test where it came from. And these are objective measurements. And that's the key. It's a measurement. It's not an opinion. It's a measurement, an empirical measurement. And then I realized, well, there's ways to actually measure diet and what we should be eating. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant because then you don't need to rely on an opinion. And that's where stable isotope testing comes in, which for those people that don't know, if you dig up ancient remains of human skeletons from whatever time period, the collagen in those bones is intact. It's free of water. It's not dry, but it is intact. And just like we have bodies that are well preserved in bogs around the world and in glaciers, some of these bodies actually have hair still in them, and we can measure the hair and see, what happened. Whether they were taking cocaine, which some of them were in South America at least. And when we take the collagen, we can look at the things that collagen is made of, so carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, yeah, all these nitrogen, and we can plot on a chart where they came from. And depending on the pattern on the chart, we can say, okay, they mainly ate aquatic animals, or they mainly ate terrestrial animals, or they mainly ate plants and things. And when we do that, we can measure the diet. And it was basically, depending on which paper you read, roughly 70% minimum as just meat. So they ate almost exclusively meat, which also suggests the only time they didn't was when there wasn't enough prey going around. But they were obligate hypercarnivores, meaning if it was available, they would eat nothing but meat. Now, in terms of that's what they ate, but is that optimum? That's another question. And that's a really key word. Well, you have to understand that carbohydrates just wouldn't have been available like they are today for obvious reasons. And so where would they have been? A couple of weeks in the year when it was summer and fruits were growing, yes, I'm sure they probably ate a few. And that allowed them to put on some fat for the winter. Now, was it optimum? Well, our genes that we have today, they were being selected when we were evolving. We can take it back, 4.5 million years ago. And that is the time when we can do these stable isotope tests and figure out what they actually ate. In other words, the diet of that time is the diet that our current genes in 2024 have been selected for. So, yes, it is optimum. And also, some people may say, well, how do you know we're not actually optimally running on some kind of carbohydrate? Well, it's a good question. We couldn't have been optimized to evolve, or we couldn't have evolved to be optimized to run on something we hadn't come across. You can only evolve to be optimized to the environment you're in. So it's impossible for me to grow up in, I don't know, the Arctic Circle and be optimized for the Sahara Desert for obvious reasons. But it's the same for food as well. So that is what our ancestors actually ate as a measurement, not an opinion. And we can say it's optimum because that they're still the same genes that we have now, if that makes sense.
So if we're eating this diet we've evolved to eat, then
Yeah,
we are giving our mitochondria what they need, right?
absolutely. I think it's not just about giving them what they need, because actually what they need is things that are the subject of biochemical processes, which glucose and fatty acids and amino acids are then converted into. They all get converted into something called acetyl CoA. So as far as our mitochondria are concerned, they're always receiving the same thing. It's how they get there. When we use glucose to make that thing, or when we use fatty acids to make that thing, has a very, very different effect. And that's where longevity comes in. That's where something called the Randle cycle comes in. And I'm very, very fortunate because this isn't taught in universities anywhere. In fact, I don't know how many doctors I taught in New Zealand in the past week, but none of them had heard of it. But I had a tutor in university who once mentioned it to me. Now, because I was a terrible student, I never paid attention and I thought it was boring. Now I study it in my spare time, so how times have changed. But he mentioned it. And when I started to look into Weston Price, I remembered what he said. And he wasn't an expert, but he told me the rough gist of it. And I looked at that back then. So I've been studying this thing for many years. I'm not an expert because every time I look at it, I learn something new. I would suggest people look to someone like Professor Bart Kay or Eddie Goki. They know way more than this than I do, because I have quite broad interests. But this is where the longevity aspect comes in. Yes, we're eating that particular diet, but how we eat it makes a difference to our longevity. And essentially, if we're using glucose versus if we're using fatty acids, the processes that end up with acetyl CoA to feed the mitochondria are slightly different. And what happens is if you try and engage both those processes at the same time, you inherently trigger inflammation. I've taken a lot of information, by the way, and compressed it just so this isn't a 6-hour boring lecture, but it becomes very inflammatory. And so when you have that inflammation, you also have the possibility of locking out glucose from the cell. And locking out glucose from the cell, if people really think about it for a second, is lack of response to insulin. Because if it's locked out and insulin comes along saying, take this glucose, but we've locked it out, we're not taking it. And that's why the glucose stays in the blood for longer. When it stays in the blood for longer, then obviously we term that in allopathic medicine as the label insulin resistance, regardless of whether it is or not, which I don't think it is, but that's the label we give. But then this bioenergetic process of trying to process everything to feed the mitochondria has led to that blood glucose level going up. And therein lies one of the first steps to chronic disease of many, many kinds in Western society, hence the longevity aspect of my career now. Once that is in there and we have an elevated blood glucose, if that's done chronically, then we have diabetes, be it type 1 or type 2, depending on the pathophysiology. And if that's left in there, then that's going to affect the circulation system, damage the cells of the circulation system. So the lining, the blood vessels, all these sorts of things. And the glucose sticks to these proteins and affects their ability to do their job properly. It can even mutate DNA. Hence why it's locked out of the cell when there's too much to protect the cell. So once that is locked into the bloodstream and left out of the cell, and we have diabetes, when we have chronically elevated insulin, for instance, say in type 2, what happens there is we can get blood pressure as well because the kidneys can't get rid of the sodium. And that in combination with the glycation damage from glucose being left in the circulation system and the inflammation and all those sorts of things, that eventually can lead to other things like heart disease. I've missed out lots of steps again, but we can get there. And once we have those things, we're looking down this road of metabolic syndrome, which is plagued by, which the Western society is plagued by, looking at all these things. And eventually that develops more into towards things like heart attacks, heart disease. People could argue very reasonably that there's a very strong metabolic aspect to cancer as well, because cancer cells epitomize a Warburg effect where they don't use oxygen to respire, they ferment instead. And when you look at the mitochondria in cancer, they're they're almost like a completely different organelle entirely to a mitochondria outside of cancer because they're just so damaged you can't even tell that they look similar anymore. And so there's clearly a metabolic aspect to cancer of some kind as well. And so when we understand this, this is how, by understanding nutrition as deeply as possible and getting to mitochondrial levels, you understand the diet, you understand the aging process of inflammation and things getting worse. You understand chronic disease because the very engines of our cells aren't functioning properly, and that leads to all these other things. And that's why they're all connected, in my personal opinion. And it is just an opinion; it's not in a textbook or anything. But my opinion is they're all aspects of each other, different sides of the same coin or dice or whatever you want to call it. And so feeding the mitochondria correctly is important, both in terms of what we feed them, but also how we feed them as well. If someone insists on a mixed macronutrient diet, I would suggest to minimize that as much as possible. You can't do it completely, but you have a carnivore meal separated from a non-carnivore meal. So you have a meal that's just protein and fat, and a meal that's just carbohydrates and protein instead, and you keep them separate. Once you start to mix, you go down the road. Not that you're going to get chronic disease, but you're headed more in that direction than not, shall we say? And that's the sort of meeting point, the crossroads of my career, where all these things come at the same time, and how I ended up there from dentistry.
So I'm interested to get your feedback on something in relation to
Sure.
the Randle cycle. So the fact the cell is closed and the insulin can't get in. Um, I've heard another doctor say kind of the opposite thing, and so the problem with diabetes is because you're consuming fat, because fat makes the cell get locked, and therefore that's what causes the problem. And my reaction would be, yeah, but you're consuming sugar or carbohydrate in the first place, so just knock that on the head. But is it a valid argument?
It's a good question. I think, and I say it's a good question because I think for some reason this question is becoming more popular. So it's good to ask to allay people's confusions. Um, I'll give you my opinion. My opinion is eating more fat does not cause diabetes. Eating carbohydrates such that you have chronically elevated blood glucose is the diabetes in itself, the chronically elevated glucose. Fat does not necessarily need a transporter in the same way glucose does, because our cells are made of fat, so they can get in much easier than glucose can. And when there are some fatty acids in the cell, they can sit there completely inert. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a doctor's surgery waiting room, and you have some people come in, some adults, they come in and they just take a seat. They would represent fatty acids. They've entered the cell and they're just taking a seat. They're not harming anyone, nothing like that at all. Then you have a couple come in with, I don't know, 17 kids, pick some ridiculous number. And somehow they are all twins. They had 17 kids at the same time. This mother was enormous during pregnancy. And they're all sort of 1 year old. So they're really, really screamy and cryy all the time. So this family comes in and take a seat in the same waiting room. Now, these kids are going to be screaming, crawling everywhere. So one of them might vomit somewhere, have a wee, they need a nappy changing. It's just chaos. And so glucose is akin to that in this analogy. The fatty acids are taking a seat, just reading a magazine, not doing anything. The glucose, on the other hand, can't help but be inherently damaging because it is a type of a sugar. It's a hexose, it's 6 carbons, but it's also an aldehyde. And what happens is this molecule is sticky in layman's terms, and it can stick to DNA. It can cause mutations there. It can stick to proteins and limit the protein's ability to do what it needs to do. And that's why the body tries to clear glucose first, because the fat will just sit there minding its business, but the doctor will come out and say, "Do you know what? You guys hold it there. You just sit there. Please carry on reading your magazine because I know you're calm and you're nice people. Let me see these kids first so we can get them out of here and everyone can relax, and then we'll get to everyone else." And that's what the body is doing. It is trying to clear glucose first because of its inherent glycative ability, its inherent damaging ability, and then it will get to the fat. Typically, what's been said, shall we say, in the scientific community in teaching for a long time is we clear glucose first because it's the preferred source. Well, how do you know it's preferred when you've never studied someone on a carnivore diet, which hasn't been done? By the time they looked at this research, we had already been 13,000 years into the agrarian revolution, where plant food is a staple of the Western diet. And let's take that argument that it's preferred. Then, yes, it makes sense that it would clear that first. But then let's take the argument that it's damaging, so it has to clear damage first. Well, by that argument, if that's the case, then it would still clear glucose first. And we clear glucose first. So how do you know it's because it's preferred and not because it's damaging? Well, we know that it is damaging because we look at HbA1c tests, where this is something that you see on a blood test for those that don't know, and it essentially measures the glycation in that particular person, or an estimation of the glycation. And the glycation is how much of this waiting room has been covered in vomit by these kids. How much damage has glucose done by attaching onto things and not letting go? And so I personally don't believe that eating more fat causes diabetes. And I would disagree with that, with the utmost respect for whoever said that. But I'll be willing to defend my position.
And that is The easiest to remember analogy. That's
Yeah.
awesome, and just the fact that you said, glucose is sticky, I mean, that really goes with the kids' example as well, because 'cause they're gonna have
Yeah,
sticky hands and all that kinda thing,
yeah.
right?
And when we
Yeah.
have sugar, when we eat something sugary, cake or chocolate bars, we have that residue on our hands, right? And you can remember if we have if you're eating something with your hands, like a bit of chocolate, and it is left on there, you just feel that inherent stickiness sometimes. So it's a good, easy way to remember. Whereas if you have, let's say you're eating something fatty, like a bit of steak or something, it's not that it's sticky, your hands are actually lubricated almost. So it's a nice, easy way to remember which is sticky and which isn't.
Yeah, yeah, very nice. So, when you're in front of a group of doctors or a group of students and you're talking about stuff like this, what kind of reactions do you get, especially if it's doctors that have been practicing for a while?
It's a really good question. I can tell you exactly what reaction I get because I've just been doing it for close to a week in Auckland, which is a beautiful country, by the way. It's amazing. It's silence. I get silence because typically, what I think when people get told these sorts of things, it's oh no, but dot dot dot. Yeah, but it's the dot dot dot. But the way I do it similar to what I've just described in this interview. I start with things they know and they have to agree with. So I said to you, well, let's start with what is the optimum diet? Let's look, okay, well, take opinion out of it. We have to be clear because opinions can be biased. And they'll go, yeah, perfect. And then I said, okay, well, let's start then. If I took a urine sample, you can't argue. If I took a hair sample, you can't argue. Everything I said before. And they're all sitting there nodding and they agree. And I said, well, what if we took a collagen sample? You can tell what the collagen component. Yeah, we all agree. And then I say, well, we've done it. And this is what they ate. And they can't shake their head because they've just nodded all the way up till now. So they've agreed to the findings before I've told them what the findings are. So if they disagree, they're actually disagreeing with themselves. So they're caught in this, I don't know what to say because I can't disagree because it's a measurement, not an opinion. But it's also the opposite of what I've been taught up till now. So they don't shake their head, they don't nod their head, they just sit there not saying anything. And when I say it in the context of the Randle, when I move on to the Randle cycle after that, they're in even more silence because the Randle cycle is not an idea. It's not a proposition necessarily. It's a real observable biochemical process. And it's happening right now in all of us, whether it's upregulated or not. It's that the apparatus is the machinery is there. And so again, they can't argue because if you do a study where you look at epidemiology, you could say, yeah, but what about this, the way the statistics were found and collected and all these things? Very valid point. But if you look at biochemistry, you can't argue. It just is. You can't. It's happening right there. It's a real, tangible, observable thing. So you can't say, well, it isn't happening when it is happening right in front of you. So it's silence. It is absolute silence. The response that I get, as I'm sure you can probably imagine.
Yeah. But do they kind of warm up to the idea, or is it just
Yeah.
like, does it just stay that way the whole way through?
Yeah, they do because when you teach these sort of things, even to medical professionals who are generally more closed to the idea than the public are, because medical professionals have guidelines they have to follow, they have insurance to please, etc., etc. When you have people that are more closed to the idea, you have to take a different approach. Hence, why I always start with things they know. And once they see that they can't argue with me, they realize they have to be more open minded. So once I keep going, and then once I go through the Randle cycle, I talk about the onset of chronic disease, I talk about mitochondria, I talk about all these things start to click in their head that have never clicked before. All doctors have questions that don't have answers, things that don't make sense, things that aren't in the textbook, and we just pass them off. When I start to explain what I explain and I go even further beyond the Randle cycle, like I said, into chronic disease and all these things, they're questions which they've always had no answers to start to get answers. And so they start to really pay attention. And it's nice because at the end of the talk or the lecture or the conference, people come up to me and they say, I'm going to give that a go. Or some people come up to me. In fact, in New Zealand, I had a guy, Colin, if he's watching. Colin said to me, you know what? I actually had 2 patients who had a lot of problems, and they came to me one day and they said they're carnivore now and all their problems have disappeared. And then he obviously saw me talk about it and he said, "Do you know what? I'm gonna do it as well." And I actually converted a few people while I was over there. So I think this particular approach to it, starting off with what they know, saying that you can't have opinion, saying that you have to have measurement that's objective, not subjective, and you can't argue, and you build and build and build from there. I would urge people, anyone teaching this, to work in the same way because you get no arguments, thanks to that approach. And also, you do get people willing to try it. And it's really rewarding because, people that I met a few months ago when I was last in New Zealand, probably around April-ish, May, something like that, where I introduced the idea briefly. When I met the same people and they've not gone carnivore, but they've gone towards that direction. And they said to me, "I feel so much better. I feel incredible." So it's really rewarding. They are open to it. Maybe it's just because of the way I teach it. I don't know. But either way, it's working. And as long as I can spread the message, even for free with my YouTube channel, I'll be happy.
Yeah, it really sounds like an effective method. It's like it reminds me of kind of you watch a movie with a lawyer in a courtroom who's really good at cross-examination and like basically they're closing asking questions to close off all the doors. So when they get to the final question, the person has no other way of doing it, answering but saying yes. Yes, I did
Absolutely.
do
And yeah,
it.
that's in my mind when but at the first opportunity that I got to teach this, which is a while ago, that is exactly what went through my mind. You know, it's almost like you are a lawyer as well as a teacher of some kind. And I've found that if you just say to people, "You should eat this way. This is the best," as a lot of people do on YouTube, you can see in the comments there's just disagreement. But when you work it as a lawyer, well, not work as a lawyer, but when you treat it as law and you work exactly what you just said there, I think you have a much higher success rate for sure.
So, like moving out of there, when you're consulting with sports people, for example, um, is it a bit easier to kind of get them to focus on that kind of carnivore, for example, or even keto to as a more nutritious way of living?
Again, really good question. Unfortunately, they're probably the hardest, even though they generally don't have disease. And the reason is because they have more to lose. Someone who is already in the world of chronic disease, who has tried allopathic medicine, doesn't really have more to lose because it's just a diet, there's no drugs, they might as well give it a go. Someone who is, at the pinnacle of elite sport, they have a lot more to think about. What if my performance goes down and I'm dropped out of the team? This is my livelihood. And especially when you consider the fact that people assume, even the players, they assume because a member of staff is part of the team, they must be automatically correct. They must be the best. They must be God in some way, and everything they're saying is biblical. However, that's not the case. Many nutritionists in elite sports teams, in my opinion, are completely, and I want to be respectful here, but they are just wrong, plain wrong in my view. And so when I come along and I say to these players, this is the optimal diet, they have the nutritionist in the other ear who's already at a top ranking club saying you need to eat veg, you need to eat all this. So the player thinks, well, I'm already, top of my game. Why would I listen to anyone else? And that's the difficulty. So again, I have to work through this process that I just went through here. And even then it's tricky. So what we generally tend to do is to really, really lengthen out the transition. So if we go, for instance, with just changing breakfast from cereal to eggs, that's it. That might be all we do. And they notice they're not hungry by lunchtime and they've got no performance drop. So then we make one tiny change again on top of that and we go from there. So things start to work in that way and they do slowly say, I feel better. When they get that first inkling that, yes, I actually feel really good, or I'm not getting tired as much on the pitch, then they start to trust me more and they believe everything I'm saying. And then they start to do it. And I can't say names because I have non-disclosure agreements. But there are players in the Premier League who are carnivore. Now, they can't say it publicly because the teams are sponsored by people like Lucozade and Gatorade and whatever, which is just liquid carbs, right? So literally, so they can't come out and say carbs are unhealthy when they've got those sponsors. But in private, yeah, they're eating this way. Um, Now, those players may come public at some point. I don't know. Um, I can't say them, but if they publicly say they work with me, then I can confirm. But because of confidentiality, I can't go and say I work with that person of my own accord. However, former England captain Adam Hollioake in cricket, I've just done a podcast with him. I think that'll be out this week at the time of recording. He's just gone fully carnivore, and he said he's never felt more amazing in his life, and he would have done it a long time ago if he could. And that is someone who has reached not just international sport, but captaining at international level as well, with some of the best players in the world at the time. So it's growing. It is growing. But we have in that kind of world the resistance from A, like I said, the existing nutritional dogma, and B, sponsorships, which are carb heavy depending on the sponsor. So it's more difficult in that kind of world. But judging by the fact that all the players I work with came through word of mouth, no marketing, no advertising, I think it's growing. And it's going to get bigger over time, I think. In fact, the New Zealand All Blacks, I remember they went carnivore and they won the World Cup. And you listen to or you read the experiences of those players who said they were running around on the pitch, it's not getting tired. People can't ignore that. It's getting ridiculous now in terms of how good the performance level can be. And if athletes are watching this, I would suggest you do it slow. If you transition quickly, your performance will dip for a few months before it comes back up. So if you want to work with someone like myself, it doesn't have to be me, anyone, you just need to be mindful of the way you transition.
Yeah. It's almost like it's, it's the secret
Yeah,
kind of thing that you don't wanna give out to the opposing team, right?
that's what New Zealand did. They didn't want to say it publicly because it was almost like a secret. Why would we tell everyone what gives us a better performance when that this particular method A is free and B, it's accessible by anyone. And anyone can do it regardless of your country, the laws in that country, the legislations, whatever doping regulations there are. So why would we give it away? And that's basically what they said. And actually, that's touched on a good point, which is all these things about longevity that people say. It's not about magic supplement. It's not about a magic treatment or some trick. Honestly, longevity and everything you need to do, the basics, they're either free or not going to cost you any more than what you're spending. There's no money to be made if you're being true in longevity. And I don't sell anything specifically for longevity. I might talk about things longevity related in a sort of clickbaity way for YouTube. But the truth is, if you want to live as long as possible, it's not about doing something to give you extra years and some trick. It's about not doing things that lead to disease. And diet is the biggest cause of that.
So, how do you eat day to day? And what did you do for that almost 30-hour flight?
Great question. So typically, I will have about one meal a day, not because I'm aiming for one, but because I only get hungry once a day. And when I get the hunger signal, I start eating. And when I feel like the food just doesn't taste good anymore, then I'll stop eating. Simple as that. And nowadays, that will come to, on average, let's say 1.5 kilograms of meat in a meal, roughly speaking. And I know that sounds like a lot to a lot of people, but it's not a lot. And I can, again, measure that because I only have a very, very, very slight increase in glucose when I look at my glucose meter. Sometimes I don't even have that. And the way you figure out how much is too much protein is you'll see a glucose increase on a glucose meter. So for me, that's about right. And that's what I would eat. On the close to 30 hours of flying, I've just finished as of a few hours ago. I had in my hand luggage some C8, which is a type of fatty acid, capric acid. I had it in powder form, liquids and security and all that. So I had to have it in powder form. I got that from theketopro.com. And I also got some electrolytes from there. I'm not sponsored by them, by the way. It's not an advert. It's just being open about what I use. And I also had some dried meats that I got from the Real Food Company in the UK. It's some dried British grown grass fed Wagyu, which is really, really delicious. And I also had some pemmican bars. I forgot the brand. So that's all I needed really, and it's nice that I can take it in hand luggage, and I always leave the plain food. Now the staff are always amazed when I do a 17-hour flight without eating anything, but it's easy for me on this diet.
Yeah, it's easy also just to if you don't have something, just to be able to go, "Well, I'm just not gonna eat." You know? I was on a it was only a 6-hour flight recently, and the lady kept coming up to me and saying, "Are you sure I can't get you anything?" And it's like, "I'm okay. I'm fine."
Same.
Yeah. Mm. So, how can people reach out to you, Doctor Abbs? Do you have you've mentioned your website. You got a channel as well, yeah?
Yes, yeah. The channel is just Dr. Abs. If you type it in, it should be the first one that comes up. My website is www.drabs.clinic. So typically, I treat people face to face in London. Occasionally, it might be in different countries, but that's not regular, and it's not necessarily planned that far in advance. It depends on where I am. So after this, like I said, I'm off to Norway, then I'm off to Switzerland and Kosovo, then Albania. If I'm going to those places, sometimes I might put something on my story on my Instagram saying, "Look, I'm going to be here," and someone might message me from that place and said, "Are you in the city?" And I might go, "Yeah." And if I've got time, I might do a clinic there, depending on what's available. So typically in London, yes, and I will work either with professional athletes for sports performance optimization, or I will work with anyone for cosmetic improvements, face, body, skin, whatever. Or I'll work with people to try and manage chronic disease as well. So someone with, let's say, arthritis, someone with autoimmune conditions, someone with diabetes, and we get a hold on diseases as well. So a few different things, but they're all just variances of each other in my mind.
Well, I'll link to all those, in the show notes. Dr. Abs, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge and experience with us, especially when you've just got off one flight and you're about to get on another one. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. People don't know this, but I was actually delayed in this interview because the flight was delayed. So I feel really bad for Dave missing. He was waiting for me, but I wasn't there unfortunately because I couldn't message him. So we've delayed this by a few hours. So thank you for waiting, Dave, and hopefully this was entertaining and informative for your audience.